Well, hello. My name is Dr. David Bray. I'm the director at the Atlantic Council GeoTech Center. We're excited to have you here today for a discussion on could technology protect privacy when a crisis requires enhanced knowledge. This is part of the Data Salon Series that the Atlantic Council is excited to be partnering with Accenture on. And to that end, I'd like to turn to my co-host, Stephen, to talk a little bit about both the historical journey that these Data Salon Series have done and where we hope to go with it, and how we hope to make this an interactive conversation amongst peers about where we can go together to make sure we're doing data appropriately, inclusively, and with representation to make sure it's used for good. Stephen, if you could share a little bit about the background of these salons, that would be great.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bray. We are really excited to kind of bring these back and online and accessible to folks, because it really kind of strikes the heart of why we're doing this, right? And for those of you, I see a couple of names who were there at the very first one, what was it, October of 2018. And we began that first meeting with a statement of inclusion and a commitment to a zero tolerance policy for any kind of exclusionary views. Back then, the issues du jour were really the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and discrimination against Muslims. The Brett Kavanaugh hearings, obviously, were about misogyny. Today, we're faced with a different set, yet related challenges. And at Accenture and at the Atlantic Council, we're really dedicated to that diversity, to diversity and inclusion. And that means we want to go out of our way to make room for voices that have historically been excluded, and ensuring that everyone we work with really feels like they belong and has a voice. And we really will not tolerate racism, misogyny. We do not, misinformation, exclusion, or any other form of hate. We refuse to let it be part of our platform and the work that we do or inform those views. And we believe in diversity because it makes us and our work better, and far more importantly, because it's the right thing to do, which is honestly why a lot of us are in this work to begin with. So, amongst us, we've curated a community of peers that we really respect and trust to both hold us accountable and share advice, whether we solicit it or not. Please speak up. We want to do and be the best that we can possibly be. And in that spirit, if any of you wish to share your thoughts, feelings, opinions, please feel encouraged to reach out. If you have topics, themes, or speakers you'd like to see highlighted, especially ones that could improve our inclusion and diversity efforts, please let us know. We're keen to be part of progress and be part of the solution. With that, I would like to introduce my friend and mentor in some respects, Davi Ottenheimer, who is a VP at Inrupt. I know he started as with roles around trust and security there, and I would imagine that they keep giving him more hats because he's just so capable. And I'm really excited that he's created this presentation for us today, where he'll kind of go through some slides, and we'll open it up for discussion in the sense that we've had before. So hopefully we have a lively discussion where we always look at this as we're amongst an audience of peers, and we can all learn things from each other. So please feel encouraged to speak up and contribute to the discussion. Thank you so much. Davi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. You're too kind. Hopefully I can repay the favor by giving a good presentation here. I wouldn't want to disappoint you. The challenge I found is the world has changed significantly, amazingly, in the past 3-4 months. And for the last several years, I've been giving presentations about these topics. But for example, in February, even in RSA conference, I gave a talk about the concept of Facebook, or November of last year as well, Facebook being a platform of human trafficking, akin to the slavery plantations. And I've made the parallels in security and audit conferences. And there were two tracks of people. There were people who said, why would you ever bring up history and politics into a security talk? What are you doing? This is a technology forum. And the other people said, thank you so much. I'm glad you finally did this. And so the change I've seen is that I no longer have people saying, why are you doing this? Which I've always had in my career. What are you doing stitching history into these narratives? But I can't get away from it. First of all, my background's in history, so that's just a natural curse. But I carried with me my whole life. But the second part is when I look to how we're going to build the future, as Churchill famously said, the further you look back, the further you can see ahead. And so when asking questions during this time, what's the best technology, it's just second nature to me to say, well, have we been in a similar situation in crisis where we have to build technology? Or what have we done in situations in the past where we're rushed to both preserve something like a right, a privacy, but also solve for a greater good? So that's what this the technology presentation is about. For my day-to-day, as you say, I work at Inrupt. I'm actually designing specifications, protocols, software, building platforms that will be used by people. So it's much more on the technologist side. I just came from a large database company, for example, which, perfect example, even though they're based in New York City, even though the population of New York City is 25% Black, this is a company that says, we're proud to be from New York City and we're proud to be a tech company from New York City. They have no Black executives and have never had Black executives. And that was a sore point for me. But my job there was to make them safe. And the technology I built was specific to protecting people from them. So that's a very difficult position to be in, but that's, again, what the role of the technologist needs to be, is not just to be in a technology role, I feel like, to build technology in a neutral sense as though it'll be used for whatever, but actually to build it in the sense that you think ahead of how people are going to use it and to try to make it hard to do the wrong thing. So that's fundamentally what I'm going to try to present today, is how could you get better technology that actually protects privacy in a crisis situation where it has the most difficult challenges in front of it. And so in that sense, typical questions I come up against in engineering privacy controls under pressure situations are, can consent be compelled? And of course, that varies widely by culture, by nation, by community, by family. Is consent transferable? Is it delegatable? So these are things people often don't think about when they're building systems, unfortunately. But when I work with engineers, I say, now if people die, how does somebody get access after they're dead? How do they speak for themselves? In fact, in working with a large country recently on some difficult medical privacy issues, they said dead people's data is being used without consent. Now, of course, how do you get the consent from those dead people? And a mass scale. It's one of the problems I'm trying to solve. So does consent even help is another question. Like if you're giving up your privacy, a lot of people want to know, what is this for? And Microsoft years ago, I think Vint Cerf actually cited this in himself in testimony in front of the Senate, if I remember correctly. Anyway, there was a study that said, people ask, will consent help in different ways based on where they're from? So in the United States, we ask, can I get a candy bar? Then I'll give up my privacy. It seems to be self-centered, much more than in China and India. It turns out many more people were oriented around society, saying, I'll give up my privacy if there's a greater good here, solving cancer. So these are sort of counterintuitive narratives that greatly inform how technology needs to be built, because it needs to reflect different ways of approaching why people would give up consent. So who it helps. Also, there's also classification, degrees of exposure. Am I giving up a little bit of information, or am I giving up all of my information? In the famous philosophical sense, if I make a decision that ends my life, even though it's a small decision, it's a much greater one than if I make a decision that only affects me for a day, the ephemeral privacy loss. And so can consent be removed then after I make these decisions, including when I give it away to other people? And especially if I'm dead, can I have it change from person to person based on some trigger? And then what restitution is there? Because when we talk about confidentiality loss, especially data duplication, it's a high availability metric. We won't have a loss of data that's good for availability, but how do I get it back now that I've spread it around the world and everybody knows it? And that's a classic integrity as well as confidentiality risk. So that should frame it. Now I'm going to go very quickly through the next 20 or so slides. Each one's overpacked as typical for my presentations. I have a hard time, I think everyone does, but I think I particularly have a hard time narrowing things down to a shorter talk. So I'm just going to go with, let's start with the survey, which is fascinating to me. The responses we got were, when would you sacrifice your privacy? A threat to one's personal safety came up the highest. I don't know the makeup of the survey respondents. I'm sure we have some bias in some direction here because of the nature of the audience, but that to me is fascinating, that people thought personal safety would be when you sacrifice your privacy in order to protect one's safety, in other words. And community came in less than that. So national recession, very low. The reason I bring these up, though, is because people have very different views. And why I want to emphasize that is because when you look back, one of the best philosophers in history in the 1790s, Mary Wollstonecraft, said, knowledge, in other words, the loss of privacy, is rational power. And she particularly put it in the terms of the reason, like a lot of people mistake women for being inferior, and think of this, the 1790s, she's saying, is because women haven't been allowed to educate themselves. If they had access to knowledge and intelligence in a way, they would be equals that people couldn't deny. And she even uses this as a way to justify the abolition of slavery. And so she speaks very much about how to treat women as humans, as opposed to this thing, this woman that you set aside, right? And the same for other races. She basically says knowledge has a very, very important role. Now, the flip side of that, if you turn it around, is the 1920s in particular, you see that America denied women privacy. And I think this has been underreported, widely underreported, but I pick up threads of it. For example, this quote from a book that says the decline of the Black women's club movement in the 1920s. There's no explanation why the Black women's club movement declined in the 1920s, a time at which suffrage was apparently increasing and women were meeting more often. So why did it decline? Or even more to the point, why would women gatherings be required to have men present? Now, this is something I actually asked my grandmother, because she was in an active role at that time. She was a child, but she said her mother, for example, created a book club in New York City, and the book club was required to have a man present. And so they chose to have a blind man come so they could discuss books in their book club. Because they were forced to have a man, they chose a blind man. So this has been widely underreported, I think, in American history. And it's one of the more interesting points, because you see it denies women the right to privacy and to congregate, which was also done to blacks, of course. A lot of times blacks were denied the right to educate themselves, denied the right to read. In Missouri, if a black person was free and learned how to write and read, they were forced to leave the state. So knowledge definitely is associated with power. But on the flip side, you're also denied the privacy to learn that knowledge. So a lot of intricacies to how privacy and knowledge interrelate. And I frame it like that because in 8 or 9 years, I've been working on a book about big data security that I'm hopefully going to release sometime soon. I've found that the intersection of privacy and not privacy has to be described as knowledge, because it frames better why there's so much tension. And so during crisis, what you're really trying to say is we need knowledge to solve the crisis, presumably. That's the order of the day. And so that would be authorized by a lot of people. They would say, if you can solve this crisis in my, or even my neighbors or my nation's best interest, of course I'd give it up. It's the right to know for security purposes. But the guarantee of that is not, obvious. So people worry, and the question is, why do they worry? And so I've tried to break it out over the years. I've built this sort of analysis based on the capability maturity model of how knowledge increases a loss of privacy, and in sort of different stages. So the first is a binary stage. Just to go quickly here, you either know something or you don't know it. So that's, you haven't lost much privacy, but you've gained enough knowledge maybe to make a decision. But of course, you want more knowledge to make better decisions. Binary is very weak. So you might rank things. These are the top 5 things to do. From there, you might say it's hotter or colder. We're very familiar with heat maps. Heat maps are the third level of this. And then you get to an absolute sense, which is where you can say, if I don't do this, I can go out of business, for example. Auditors love the 4th stage. They'll push you to get from degrees, we seem to be losing money more or less, to if we lose this amount of money, we can't restore. We can't go back and tell our customers we're solvent. And then the 5th, which is the unobtainable, I even question whether I should have it there or not, is where you have total knowledge. There's no privacy. This is typical in cases of jail, incarceration, prison states, even family sometimes, parents, children, or even married couples where nothing is private at all. This is total privacy loss, but the old saying is no fish in too clean water. So nobody wants to live in that unless they've already given up their identity in a sense and they're willing to share it whole cloth with somebody else. But working with a lot of financial institutions, they just take for granted that when they issue credit cards, for example, there's a lot of secrecy between married couples that they have to account for in the technology they build, because, or even in large families, they just inherently assume that there's going to be secrecy, even in places where people deny that such a thing would exist. So the 5th stage doesn't really exist, but that's the safety levels. As you lose privacy, you gain knowledge, and you need to understand in each area how to build the technology for what is being asked of it. So why are people worried about losing privacy? According to the survey, overwhelmingly is because the experience of loss, right? That's biggest concern is not, I guess you could say, the biggest concern with biggest concern for losing privacy, I should say, it isn't that it's just low. It's not that we don't see real benefits of having it. It's that you actually have experienced something that's traumatic to you. And this to me is essential, because when you talk about the technology dissection, it's these, as opposed to parallel, or I should say rather one line of trust, you have these sort of orthogonal lines. And this was introduced to me, actually, Stephen, you had a presentation where I saw this in a philosophical discussion, and it just stuck with me forever. I've used it all over the place. What we see is there's a distrust line and a trust line. And so as people lose trust, what's actually happening is they are, for example, wanting to set up their own because they no longer trust something. But in distrust, they're worried about the law. So in context of racism, for example, you might not trust the police. If you don't trust the police, you would set up your own security system. But if you distrust the police, you might fear that they would kill you or your neighbors, your family, or your children. So if you understand the difference, there's a really important point here, that if you have total distrust and trust, you're in an ambivalent state. Like you say, okay, fine, do whatever you want, and if it hurts me, I don't care. Or if I lose something, I don't care. It's total ambivalence. But if you're in a situation where you say, I don't want to lose my privacy, but I trust you to like deliver my new books from Amazon, then that's different, right? So you actually do care quite a bit about losing your privacy, even though you trust them to do something for you as a service provider. And I've actually highlighted 2 examples of this, where in the report it says reduced willingness to rely on others, so you do your own when you have this feeling of distrust. But in the trust sense, I've actually pulled from Umberto Eco, who talks about fascism as a notion of you're not allowed to disagree, so you're forced to trust. And so I think you see that in some of the battering of scientists, which I'll explain later in terms of history. When scientists come forward, particularly doctors, people who study a lot to find truth in healthcare, to save lives, which is what COVID is really about, they come out saying, I disagree, in ways that oftentimes the people in power don't like to hear. That's the tension you see between somebody like a Fauci and the occupant in the White House. So if I drill down into this a little bit in philosophical traditions, Kant has a very interesting view on this, which I think has been misinterpreted, which I picked up on because a lot of people use him in the wrong way. A lot of people say, what if someone came to you at the door, the Nazi in the typical example, and are you allowed to lie, which is preserving privacy? Somebody's hidden under my floorboards. In fact, I teach a class on this to computer science students about ethics, and they bring it up. I teach in Austria, no less. And they say, can we lie to the Nazis when they ask us if we have Jews under the floorboard? And typically people would say Kant says it's immoral to lie, so you can't lie. There's this imperative not to. But in fact, a deeper analysis shows that he not only says you can, he says you should. And that's because you are now in a state of barbarism under the Nazi state. And actually by lying to them was not to wrong them. Because what you're doing is you're trying to get to where you have power with freedom and law, which would be privacy is protected, as opposed to being in a state where there is no freedom and you've lost all privacy. You have to give it up. If you're compelled and forced into a situation of a barbaric state that you don't want to be in, that's not the state you want to be in. All right. So what would technology look like? I maintain there's 2 fundamental tools right now that we need to build towards that would give people that control in a crisis timeline. So can it be consent-based? Would it be something that you could decide that you would give privacy up for? Yes, if you have the ability to disable it. And that's a real problem in platforms right now, because when you get onto a platform like a Facebook, the centricity of it is that you can't really turn anything off. Everything is Plato-like cave, hall of mirrors. What you see is what they want you to see, not what actually exists on the platform. And having worked inside the sausage factories for over 2 decades in Silicon Valley, in some of the biggest companies in the world. In fact, I've built some of the technology Facebook runs on. So I can tell you for a fact that what's going on inside these companies is very different than what is portrayed. They say too big to fail, we have security departments, but in fact, you have people inside sticking their fingers into your data all the time. It got to the point, for example, where I would build a container and then I would have whistleblowers come to me and say, we can still see inside. And so if I didn't have those whistleblowers inside the engineering teams, the DevOps and so forth, telling me we can still see the data, we can still look at user data, and the fact that people were doing it is why they were reporting it, I wouldn't have been able to run down how they were able to get in. And so that's what's really going on. So can you disable access is a fundamental question, but it's hard to answer in a centrist view. So the decentralization or re-centralization around the individual, where you can actually say, I'm turning this off in a way that you should not have access, is fundamental to the technology. Another one is reset. So given crisis timelines, are you able to go back to some place? Now this could be a backup, a restore in common terminology, but increasingly in terms of integrity, can you change the narrative? is a question. If somebody said something about you that wasn't true, can you go back to where you can say that's not true and this is the truth? So again, in a centrist model, it's very difficult to do that because you have to ask the person as the service provider, can they give you enough access or some way of representing yourself because you don't like how others are representing you on that platform. But if it goes back to you being the arbiter of truth about yourself, then different story. This gets complicated, of course, in case of healthcare because whether you are the definitive answer on whether you have or have not done something is challenged, to say the least, by IoT. For example, if a house burned down and they went and looked at the pacemaker files of the guy, the records essentially of his heart, to see if he lit the fire in his house or not. Elevated heart rate would have indicated he was running for his life as opposed to throwing gasoline around the room. And there's a true story. They convicted a guy based on the records of his heart that were streamed from the device. Another one is cars, right? The brakes, the brake lights are recording to a box inside as well as showing to the street. And some people have decided that the box that's recording whether the brake light was turned on or not is a record of public information. Even though no one saw the brake lights, the box recorded it and therefore is public information. So can you be the narrator of your own story? It depends on how you control the data and whether you are giving consent to access to that. So the privacy fundamentally comes into who gets to be the arbiter of truth about whether you're infected with COVID-19 or not. And in healthcare, I've been informed, I'm not a lawyer, but informed by many lawyers who say there's a third-party doctrine here where doctors are the record keepers or hospitals are the record keepers as well as you. So you may actually have physical copy or possession control, but you can't destroy things because you're forced to maintain them for record keeping. But the technology would account for that. So I think it comes back to, if I look at history again, is there a right here that I'm saying you have this right to turn off somebody's access to your data? You have a right to reset the data to a stage at which you believe it is clear and accurate. You can be held accountable for lying, of course, but you would be the arbiter essentially of truth about your own data or about information that you would consent to control. So is that a natural or artificial right? The survey says it's a natural right, about double, but 10 people said it's artificial. I find that hard to believe. I think those arguing for artificial are going to have to make the case. I mean, for me, we see that privacy goes back a long, long time. The Greeks talked about it, the Latin, the privus talks about setting things apart. The old French language has a sense of secrecy, secret deed. And I think the language represents what people took into account as something that comes naturally. But also we see that throughout the recent years, like in 1965, we had agreement that there's a constitutional right to privacy, debated, but still, it's something that sort of manifested as its own thing. And then in 2016, one of the most interesting approaches I've seen is that it's an essential part of a human flourishing or well-being. I mean, if that doesn't say natural to me, I don't know what does. But let me take it a step lower into the discussion where we go into anthropology. What is the human condition? What's the contextualization of human versus animal, for example, or tribal? People bring up the word tribal as though it's a bad thing. But I think in prehistoric context, sometimes people say the chimney revolutionized privacy. Before we had chimneys, in fact, The Guardian did a whole video series on this, very interesting, about how the chimney introduced privacy into culture. But in fact, the chimney is over 10,000 years old. And we see in a lot of houses that go back in this, ancient history, archaeologists talk about how there were chambers that people had different rooms for the intentions of privacy. You also have inside and outside of the house. More to the point, we've seen anthropologists talk about the Brazilian Indians who have a concept of alligatoring. And this comes up in a lot of different societies where even if they have a different sense of privacy, they still have a sense of privacy. And so I think it is a natural condition for people to have a desire to separate and to own. So that's part of why the technology is meant to reflect the human condition. So I ask, okay, given that it goes back to the whole history of human time, what's the worst possible time and place for privacy? And the answer is totally surprising to me, where 17 people said right now, the worst privacy, and China 3, one the United States and one India. I find that amazing because to me, nobody said North Korea. And that seems to be like the front and center thing that's in the news. North Korea has no privacy, but nobody brought it up. Okay, so that's one thing. Second, nobody brought up, they said right now, but nobody brought up times like the white police state America or during colonial times, when nothing was allowed to be private. We talk about the nutmeg routes and the way that the Dutch and the English feuded and tortured. Waterboarding was prevalent, in the 1600s. And all that was about making sure there was no privacy because you got to get the spices and you got to get the money and nobody had any rights. So this is interesting to me. Now, people said prehistoric or tribal times were peasant communities. I don't know how to characterize that, because in Alligatoring, for example, is evidence of these communities did have privacy. One of the shocking things about putting a water well, for example, I talk about the charity water sometimes because they've been very destructive to social fabrics. I mean, they don't even seem to understand that when they put a water well in the center of a town, it destroyed a lot of the power. And women, for example, who used to have power because they had privacy, because they could walk to the water source, which was a river, lost all that privacy and lost all their status in communities because you put the water well right next to the house now, and they have no privacy anymore. So I think to understand privacy in tribal or prehistoric times is to really think about it differently in terms of like paths people walked and times of days that they would go outside and places they would use in the nature. East Germany under Stasi, totally understandable. That seems to be, 78 is a little specific. German Holocaust, interesting one. That to me, and similar atrocities, I think is a bit broad. I think that's another good example. The final one that you can't define across times and cultures is like nails on the chalkboard to me. It's like historians do that. Of course we do comparisons across times and cultures, and anthropologists. So I'd love to hear more about why you can't do it. But just to put it back into context of what we're talking about here, in 2010, there was an electronic police state index, and North Korea came out top. In 2008, they were second, but they came out on top. You'll notice India isn't in the top 7 even here. Russia, the United States, United Kingdom, and France are. So I think you may find that surprising that United Kingdom and United States and France are high on the list. But let me just rush through now. You know, what about Austria? That doesn't come up often, but how many people talk about the 1850s Austria? Because it really was a complete lack of privacy. It was one of the worst lacks of privacy in history that I've ever found. This on the slide here on the right is note cards. It was a file of note cards that are kept about every citizen. Spies would keep a record of everything you did and put into these little neat files. I found this in a museum in Vienna. And they also had a science denial going on. So if you were a doctor, Bischoff, for example, who wanted a constitution that protected individual rights, he was put in jail. Or Semmelweis, who was famous for popularizing the idea of washing your hands, he was put in jail. I mean, people describe it as he went nuts, but I think if you dig into it, the institutions he was railing against were just so difficult. He was excluded. He wasn't allowed to be the doctor he wanted to be because he was Jewish. He wasn't allowed to enter society because he was Hungarian. He was all kinds of discrimination, and he ultimately was crazy, deemed crazy, and died a terrible, horrible death. All right. Speaking of privacy. So the environment that people lived in, no freedom of press, the churches decide what you learn and how you live and what you can say. There's no jury or public trials allowed. This is an amazing time. And if you actually look at it, what's interesting is this regime fell because they used Russia influence to destroy the opposition. And then ultimately, when they got into a later conflict, they didn't side with Russia, and the whole thing fell apart. And they amassed a huge amount of debt in trying to maintain this police state. So a lot of parallels to today. All right. So another example, what about the police state in 1830s? American white police state. 1831, there was an uprising of blacks, and then whites summarily went around and looked for anyone they thought had any relation at all to this uprising. Actually, not even people that had a relation. There are examples in this Atlantic story I've linked here, where they just rode up and said, "You look black, we're going to kill you. You've exposed yourself." It's very difficult for a black person to not disclose the fact that they're black, and staying safe in this world of the 1830s was impossible, essentially, for Americans. Free black men were just murdered indiscriminately by white mobs. That led to a whole series of horrible events in the United States. You have anti-abolition rioting. You have a postmaster general. I find very few people know this, but in 1835, the postmaster general said it was his patriotic duty to inspect American mail and block anything that said anything about abolition, to destroy it. In 1835, they also said if you try to bring up abolition, you would be silenced. So you both were not allowed to talk about it, and you were accused of treason if you did talk about it. And they actually tried to ban any societies. It was similar to what I talked about in the 1920s with the black women's groups, not being allowed to congregate, or white women's groups not being allowed to congregate without men present. This is sort of a theme in American history, that they try to oppress and suppress any opposition. Very different than the context that you often hear about And in 1843, there's very good evidence of this in Edgar Allan Poe releasing Goldbug, his most popular book during his lifetime, which describes how to encrypt traffic, how to encrypt communication, so you can talk about abolition fundamentally safely, or at least more safely. And the Civil War has a lot of encryption stories in it that are very interesting. So that brings me to the end where I'll open up to questions. But what I do find is interesting in approaching technologists, I ask them questions like this one. Would you sacrifice your life to free Americans from systemic racism? And if they hedge or they don't feel comfortable answering questions like this, I then wonder if they're prepared to work on technology which will be used in the context of denying people rights or abusing their privacy. I don't take an approach on backdoors that says never should there be a backdoor ever, but rather why would somebody have a backdoor? In Java, for example, in the community in Indonesia, backdoors are essential to their entire existence. Their way of life is essentially, it's literally called backdoor Java, very confusing for Java developers. But backdoor Java is the idea that the fabric of society works through the back door, not the front door. The front door is a formality, the back door is how everything happens. And so in looking in these cultural traditions and these concepts of privacy, one of the reasons of using the back door is so that people don't see all the workers that are, all the labor and the effort going into preparation of celebrations. So the reasons for understanding that are so that you can map technology to the human condition. And so I ask people, are you aware of the human condition? And would you give it all to protect people from harm like racism? And if they're unprepared or unable, and surveys show up to 50% of cryptographers are uncomfortable or unwilling to answer questions about ethics because they say it's outside their domain. And that's a problem. It's a big, big problem. It means you shouldn't be asking cryptographers whether backdoors are safe. They can't give you a question about ethics. They probably aren't ready now to talk about power and culture and human condition. So that's the extent of my slides, and I'll open it up for discussion.
Excellent. That was a ultra concentrated presentation, Davi, and I think you've given us all a lot to think about. I see there are already some questions coming in. Real quick, while people feel free to raise your questions in the chat, raise your hands, and let me know if you also want to ask. I do have one question for you, Davi, as we're getting people queued up. You touched a little bit about systemic racism. You also talked a little bit about how IoT is going to make it hard for people to necessarily hide what they're doing, whether it's for nefarious purposes or even for vindication. I wonder, though, in an era in which misinformation and disinformation is rampant and people are sort of challenged to sort of demonstrate that they didn't do something or they didn't say something, how do you reconcile privacy with also possibly defending if someone does a misinformation attack on a group of people or on an individual? How do you reconcile those two?
Yeah, I think rather than say I have any quick answer to this, I would say this is a question that's been raised over history many, many times. And one of the things historians are good at are pointing out how it's been solved in the past or how it's been abused or misused in the past. I mean, the idea of being a historian is like walking into a whole library of books and being able to figure out which books are the truth. And so the whole idea of critical thinking and analytic thinking are at the core of how, or arbiters of truth would come to be. How does a judge or a jury of peers decide what is truth? There's a lot of miscarriages of justice, right? So we have a lot of examples of where truth was never found. We have tons of that. In the United States, we have so many incarcerations where people are found later to never have been the one who committed the crime. So I think what we need to do is learn from those systems, emulate those systems that have worked, which is basically to use critical analysis or critical thinking, and to say, okay, given all this information coming in, how do we boil it down to the few books? And sometimes you may not have a definitive story. Sometimes you'll have literally two opposed stories that you say, I don't know which one of these is right, but they're the closest to presenting the best argument for the two opposing sides, and it lives somewhere in between. So
excellent. Well, thank you for that. And I think Pablo Brewer, would you like to ask your question? You had a question about the courts and constitutional right to privacy, if you'd like to ask.
Sure. Hi. So the courts have found that right to privacy, that there is a fundamental right to privacy. However, the argument that's been made is, do participants have an expectation of privacy? And so, one of the first court cases that I'm aware of in the United States had to do with a criminal investigation and somebody going into the phone booth and closing the door, and the finding being that, no, when you close the door, you have an expectation of privacy. The other part of that, particularly in the United States, is that the discussion about privacy in the courts has mostly dealt with privacy from citizens from the government, but has not addressed industry concerns. And now with industry really controlling the vast amount of information, how do we go back and re-examine that issue?
Great questions. This is what's so difficult about technology today is we have to build consent in. And so what is the presumption of the person who's using the technology? Are they consenting to having all their information read? I ran into this many, many times, as I mentioned, with the development communities, that are looking in, peeking into people's data. Well, let me put it this way. Let me back up a step. There's a support model, which says I need to see everything. I need to even impersonate you in order to help fix your problems. That is a very broken mindset, and it's an assumption that's made a lot of times in Silicon Valley that I've tried to fight against. So I worked at a company years ago that had a backdoor support into everybody's data. They didn't notify customers, but the customers were happy because the systems kept working. And I had to step in and say, you're going to have to close that. And the people who had the back door said, oh my God, they will find out that our stuff doesn't work, right? And so there's a lot of nuance here that has to be worked through, but fundamentally, what I've built in the technology is often a consent which customers love, which says, I would rather my system fail. I would rather I go offline and all my data be destroyed than you look at it. And that is a simple switch. That's like the power off switch. And if they flip that switch and says, you know what, go in and look at it, but I'm going to give you 24 hours to fix it. Like, hey, the plumber's at my door. Why don't you come in and I'm going to go in the other room and do whatever you want, or I'm going to stand right here and watch what you're doing under my sink, right? Classic spy work is to pretend to be a service provider and go in and abuse the authority you're given. But in technology companies, like, these aren't spies. These aren't sophisticated nation state attackers. These are just run-of-the-mill people who are like, wow, I get all this control to make my job easier, and these people have no privacy. So yeah, great question. And the technology can be built. It is easy to do. It's just a matter of the tech companies having the desire, having the leadership to do it. They could build a much better privacy consent platform. Now, another way to look at this, I'll give you two examples. Use the phone booth, which is interesting because, what represents the phone booth in our technology space? Closing the door, for example. What does that mean when you close the door? Can you get a close the door in use of an application like Zoom, like anything? And the answer is yes. So in software space, you would be building things, but you'd be disclosing them in a way that should be simple for people to understand. One of the problems is we make it very difficult for people to understand what they're choosing. And so that needs to change. GDPR has been very good about this. I think some platforms, like the Werribee platform, is excellent in the way it presents what you're disclosing and how you're disclosing it. Zoom is the worst, by far. Absolutely deceptive, continually caught out, and seems to do okay. This is not financial advice by any means, because I will tell you companies do terrible things and their stock price will go up. But I can tell you these are horrible, horrible things done at the top levels that shouldn't be happening. So to your point about companies versus nation states, also I will bring up the Uber example, because one of the most interesting cases was a woman who reported rape, and Uber executives took all of her private healthcare information, like stole her private healthcare information and widely disseminated it inside Uber executive circles. Now the question was, is this a violation of privacy law in India? Is this a violation of healthcare law? But a lot of that didn't matter. Like the legality of it, I think, and where lawyers come in, sometimes trip us up, because slavery was legal, right? So you may be totally legal in these companies. You may be just doing it. The lawyers may tell you, hey, this is totally legal what we've done. We can get out of the legal. But the ethics and the morality of it are really what need to be focused on. Did Uber do the right thing? No, and they fired these people, and they should have. That the fact they had people who even thought that was ethical gets back to my point. Like, are you taking the John Brown test? Are you thinking from the start about how to protect people from harm in a way that would really be a societal good? Because if not, you probably shouldn't be running platforms and building technology. And that's something that I've had to look at. The phone company built the closing door on the booth for a number of reasons, I'm sure. But one of the interesting ones was back in shared telephone lines, communities had one telephone booth. So you ran to the telephone and you got on it, and it was everybody shared that telephone. So it was a sense of you got to have your privacy to have the conversation on that phone. So that's where the original phone booths were built from. It was one phone for everybody to share in the public space. So of course you wanted to build in some sense of trust and privacy into it.
Thanks.
Excellent. And one thing to think about, Davi, too, is if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the group, if there's anything you'd like to pose, or if not, we can continue with the flow of other questions that have queued up in the chat. If not, we'll go on. So Chris, I think Christopher Guess, you have a question. If you'd like to ask your question, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you so much. You mentioned consent many, many times in this conversation, and I'm curious about the idea of informed consent, right? So when we're discussing consent around technology, not everybody using this platform, in fact, the vast majority of people using these platforms, and often subject to government sources as well, are not college-educated people with an understanding of the law, of understanding of contracts. These are very long, nobody reads them, right? Especially when you get outside of, the global north to the global south. These people are often even have less access to education, less understanding of the consequences of their data. Just the scale of things that can happen is beyond even most people's. So how does informed consent come into this? It's good to say, hey, we're showing you what we're doing, but if the normal person in Sri Lanka or in Alabama can't understand that, what good is it?
Yeah, this is a funny thing about the market. So I'll use Zoom again because they're the worst abuser of this. On the one hand, they say they're popular because they're so easy to use, right? But the market doesn't make their terms or their security easy to use. Their security is impossible. You can't make yourself safe on Zoom without turning yourself into a magician. And yet they call themselves easy to use. So on what metric is the market really bearing ease? Terms of service. Maybe you shouldn't use a product that has a difficult terms of service that you can't understand, that isn't clear to you whether you're safe or not. But we don't, right? We don't really go down that path often in the sense of building technology or having quality assurance. If I could say you can't release this product unless a group of people have agreed that they understand exactly what their rights are and how they would be abused if they were losing, that type of gate doesn't typically exist in a tech company. Rarely. What exists is how quickly can we get them on the platform and how quickly can we get their data into the platform, end of story. And that's not good. We need to actually move towards this model of, we're starting to with GDPR. So regulators have a fundamental role to play here. If you cannot understand clearly how to get your data off a platform, there's a problem. That's in GDPR. If you can't understand what you're consenting to, like people thought the cookie pop-ups were going to be annoying, but it actually, of course they're annoying when they're annoying, but they force a sort of market shift to where people make them not annoying. So again, I look at a platform like Whereby or Whereby, and it has a really, really good consent flip, a bunch of switches where you can say, I want my data to be used for this, but not for this. I want it to be used for this, but not for this. So the answer, I think, from a market perspective, from a nudge perspective, is the companies that should thrive are the ones that make it easy. And we shouldn't allow people to have ones that aren't easy. And whether that's regulators or just the market self-corrects, which is unlikely, but hopefully that would be the answer.
Excellent. And I think Jen King, Jen, you have a question that you'd like to ask. Are you able to turn on your microphone or possibly your camera too? If not, I can ask it for you.
Yes.
There she is.
Hello, good morning. Hey, Davi. Yeah, so this is really, really interesting. And what you said, sorry, I have my notes here, about you being the arbiter of your own truth, I thought was a really interesting point. And I was actually just asked this in a debate yesterday about the conflict between privacy and the right to be forgotten. And I was thinking about that a bit as you were discussing that, and the tension between us trying to use consent to write our own truth with this larger societal need to want to kind of, I guess, construct a narrative of truth, and how we reconcile that individual need when potentially it conflicts with that larger social need. Or, in the case of something like right to be forgotten in the EU, you're using it to potentially, expunge your record of things that, you don't want people to know. So I think there's an interesting tension there, and I'm just curious where you come in on that. Thanks.
Wow, it's a shifting topic, I think, recently. Again, like November of last year, I gave a talk where I laid out that Facebook was a slavery platform. And again, in February, I doubled down and I said, really, it maps in my mind to what slave traders were doing, the cotton gin, for example, even. So there's two parts of this. One, historians often talk about how you can find truth in narratives. whether it's your own or when looking at autobiographies. You know, is this an accurate presentation of the person? So Grant's autobiography is a fantastic telling of Grant's work as a civil rights pioneer and a masterful general and president. But the story that people are told is completely fictitious. They're told by the losers of the Civil War that he was a terrible general and he was a terrible president and all these bad things. But that's all wrong, and it's all false narrative. And Grant can't come back from the dead and be like, read my autobiography. So there's really good examples of how we have this already in our current culture, and it's really not working. Like the statues put up of Confederates is all lies. It's all erasing history. We allow people to erase history with these Confederate statues. And so we need to take them down because we'd restore history. We'd restore the truth by taking them down. I write blog posts about this all the time with lots of details why. But that actually is, you know, if you think about it in terms of slavery, and you think about Facebook in terms of slavery, your human body, there's a feminist narrative around digital rights, but the human body in a digital sense is a digital body. And if you're giving up your digital body to someone else who then uses it for money, sells it, it's a form of exploitation, right? Human trafficking. And so you have not consented in that human trafficking, and they're portraying you in a way, the way women are portrayed as the prostitutes or the promiscuous ones, right? The sort of male hierarchy has taken a woman, sold her body, and then portrays her as promiscuous, even though it's their business model, right? So how do you get back to where you tell the story about yourself being a human who deserves rights, who deserves like healthcare, for example, right? A lot of men won't give sex workers healthcare because they portray them as these promiscuous people who aren't deserving of it. But in fact, they have rights, and they should be portrayed as people who have rights, and they should be able to tell their own story. So this is where I think the discussion should be going, which is people have ownership, should be able to tell the story, and there should be validation stages of that. And again, I don't fear, for me, there's not a slippery slope in integrity narratives, because I live in the world already of history that has tons of false history. So I've seen the worst of it, and it's already there. So we can actually live in this world of integrity and using critical thinking and analysis, and again, jury of peers and so forth, and community-based measures, we can build safer, better narratives. And ownership of that really, I think, is a key to a market thriving. If you delegate it out, this is Wollstonecraft's theory in general. If you allow women to tell their own story, you suddenly realize they're equals. But if you tell their story, then you make them the thing you want, and then you destroy them, essentially. They never get to be what they really are. And that was her critique of Rousseau. That was her critique of the interpretation of the French Revolution and the whole idea of rights being awarded to anyone.
And I think this actually touches, sorry,
Go ahead, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this touches on kind of the question that Ahmed is asking too around facial recognition, right? Do we have, like, you know, should we be informed that we have this, you know, basically this agency and autonomy that we might enjoy, or freedom that we might enjoy from prying eyes? How do we understand when that's being stripped away from us? How do we know, you know, if facial recognition is being used to track us, is being used to, you know, tell who I'm meeting with, or, you know, who might be interested in that information? And yes, if I'm doing it in a public sphere, I might have less of an expectation than if I, you know, close the proverbial door of that phone booth. You know, I think that's it's a great kind of way of, you know, that we're looking at it now, especially as we look at, you know, the removal of, you know, facial recognition from law enforcement. You know, I think that's a great question. I'd love to hear, you know, from Davi or others on, you know, some thoughts on that.
The thing about facial recognition, what it really is identification. And so the question is, do you want to be identified? Because that transfers power. A really good example of this, again, in terms of narratives and false history, is, you know, Robin Hood was a made-up character, presumably. And so nobody was really Robin Hood, right? Luddites, King Lud was a fictitious character from the Sherwood Forest, same place. And essentially, you see over 2 different generations the same attempts to create a fictitious character, because nobody could kill the fictitious character. Once you give your identity up to the police, in theory, you lose a lot of power, unless you're able to amass enough power to resist that of the authorities. Being identified is a very scary thing. You lose in the negotiation in power. So I think we need to tell this in American context, in modern context, not the Luddites. The Luddites fundamentally were opposed to losing rights. They weren't against technology at all. They didn't like people being treated poorly. which is lost in the narrative. Again, a false narrative that's always been told. The Luddites actually were very progressive, thinking about people should be treated fairly and get fair wages. Robin Hood, almost the same thing. Don't let the sheriff come and steal your money. So in American context today, we see actually sort of celebrity context. I think I would put it in terms of paparazzi. About people who are famous don't want to be identified. And the facial recognition was these people with cameras just stroll around looking for celebrities they can capture on film and then report on. And why I bring that up is because if they can't figure it out with essentially unlimited money, unlimited resources, unlimited time that they have at their disposal, if they can't prevent themselves from being identified, then who can? So I think it's a bit of a fool's errand to try to go down the path of banning facial recognition. It is core to the fabric of networks. Identity is going to be core. But having the opt-in, opt-out is where we need to be. It's a very binary decision to tell the police you can't use it at all. They need to be able to identify somehow. They just can't use this technology. And I think it's overblown to say that the technology will destroy civilization. I mean, in some sense, everything I've been writing about in my book is that automation has terrible consequences. The machine gun had terrible consequences, right? The automation can bring huge death if it's used improperly, but it also represents a power shift. So what you're really asking is, who should be able to recognize other people? Why? And would that person consent to being recognized for what you're going to use their information for? Across the board, people are saying police aren't trusted, but they're also saying they're distrusted. They're going to lose something.
Very helpful. And I think we have another conversation from Joseph. Joseph, would you like to ask your question about what can we think about the 3.8, 3.7 billion people that still don't have the internet, and how we can make sure that we maybe have, what can we do differently now for those 3.8, 3.7 billion that we didn't do for the initial 50% that did get access to the internet? So Joseph, maybe if you want to ask your question, and then we can open it up to both Davi and everybody else too.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, my camera is acting up today. I was on yesterday, but I don't know. I must have dropped my computer. Anyway, my question really is in regards to bridging that the gap, the disparity gap, really the digital divide is what they're calling it now, where you've got, your Eastern countries, you've got your Africa, you've got your Chinas that are just now getting online, right? And so they don't have an idea about any of these privacy concerns. They're literally grabbing a phone or, maybe even one of those old school Nokias that has internet, and they're just logging in and saying yes to whatever they see, because they're trying to get access to what everyone else has access to, for whether it's digital finance or anything else. How do we effectively ensure that they're not being taken advantage of from any of the other aspects we're talking about, from facial recognition all the way to getting their identification taken? How do we educate them and then ensure that they know what they're getting into? And you guys kind of alluded to it earlier. They may not have the education on this to begin with. So it's really breaking it down kind of to their level, if you will. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way.
No, actually, I think it's the opposite. I think because they don't have a history of it, they're not emboldened to false narratives about what it is. They're not going to have a varnished view of what Facebook is. They're going to look at it from a true human perspective and be like, what is this crap? And so what we saw in Ethiopia, for example, is they dropped tablets in that were, parentally secured. And this is a group of Ethiopian kids who had not used technology, school kids, and they hacked those pads in a day. Within one day, they completely decimated the parental controls and were doing whatever they wanted to, rooted them basically. So I think the human across the globe is very crafty, and not having the burden of history of society that tells you what the internet is or isn't, the have and have not narrative, not having that actually puts you in a better position. So for example, America came after the European development, and the Europeans might have looked at America and said, oh, how are they going to understand? How are they going to make use of these technologies that we give them? But America actually then sprung out. In the same way, you can look at Africa and say, well, they're not dropping copper lines down the streets, but if they put millimeter wave towers up and they start to use, cashless systems to make payments on mobile devices, then they've just leapt forward, while we're still paying to put fiber under streets that have rotting copper so we can get fast enough speeds to do a video chat. They're there in a day or a week. So the opportunity is actually, it's a greenfield space. The opportunity is for them to lead us and to figure out where we should go, because it's putting technology, new technology, into the hands of people who haven't been spoiled by the conservative legacy that we're stuck with, if that makes sense. So I'm very excited to see that there's a young population that's looking at new ways of using technology. And I don't see the internet as a have-not, because they have networks. They have social networks, they have all of that. They use different forms of technology. But to me, sometimes it sounds like the French with semaphore and flag waving saying, oh, you with your, you know, cable wires in America trying to communicate using Morse code, what do you think you're doing? You don't have the flag system. Right. Have-nots. And then the world rotates around the new system that the people in Africa have developed. You know, Ghana has produced its own mobile phones now natively. We see a lot of innovation and investment. The real problem here is that the reason they haven't advanced, back to Wollstonecraft, is because they were denied the opportunity to advance. They were purposely held back from developing systems that would be better for them and for the world. And so we've artificially constrained competition, artificially denied the market its growth potential through racism and subjugation and colonialism, right? So I think there's a bunch of different ways this is going to manifest. You could see peer-to-peer networks, for example, growing where you don't have top-down. You could have self-sovereign identity systems growing where you don't have top-down. And a lot of those are going to manifest in cultures that are much more familiar and comfortable with those concepts than the United States is.
Joe, do you have any additional thoughts, or what are you seeing real quick before we move on to another question? Have you seen things that you've seen that are hopeful narratives of how we can do things differently?
I think David's response was spot on. When I look back at my time that I've done working with USAID and kind of working back at the time when Google was putting in fiber optic wires in Monrovia, a lot of the things that he said is exactly true. It's a data point that's unbiased, right? And so you can get an unbiased data point and a reaction that allows you to better your products. I still think that we have to be very mindful of the privacy issue, because they are a data point, right? And we are taking their data. We are utilizing whatever response, you know, we're giving them a stimulus and we're getting a response back, and we are taking that response and utilizing it for whatever reason, generally a capitalistic reason, to ensure that we get what, you know, kind of some information from them. And I think that point is still, I don't have the answer for this. I don't think there's a simple answer, but that point is something that we need to make sure we don't exploit them further, right? So to his point about colonialism and racism, we don't want to continue to exploit these marginalized countries and communities.
Well, go ahead, Davi, if you have real quick.
Yeah, a weird recent development is that Facebook announced that it's built a ring around Africa. And so they want all the communication to go through this Facebook-funded cable, undersea cable, which it's a consortium. So to be fair, it's a bunch of groups that came together, but Facebook promoted it as the Facebook cable that they put around Africa, surrounding Africa. It's a very scary prospect, because the question isn't how do we get people onto Facebook, right? How do we get them onto the internet provided by Facebook? The question is, how do we get people to move to a digital future? And in some sense, we want them to come up with their own versions of what Facebook represents, which could be better than Facebook. That's I think where a lot of the disconnect is. I ran into this when we deployed mobiles across Africa. Well, a lot of different situations, but in one particular, we deployed mobiles, and there was a shared use model where one person would buy a cell phone, and then an entire village would use the cell phone, just like the old technology, just like the old telephones all over the world were used. But the software did not account for that, did not take into account at all that you'd have lots of people logging in to a single mobile phone. And we had to, well, we decided not to actually support that, but we had to make some hard decisions about whether, in terms of integrity, two people logging into a single phone, ultimately sharing a calendar, could ever get their calendar separated again. If all of my events and all of your events suddenly collide into one calendar, good luck getting to a clean calendar again. When you just, and all you did was log in because you wanted to get your contact list so you could make a call, and suddenly your calendar is destroyed with somebody else's events, which is a privacy violation as well. So yeah, that you need to take into account the use cases in those environments, but ultimately enable them to basically come to you with the solutions or the pain that they're trying to solve, and then solve for them as opposed to deliver them the internet.
So we're getting a little bit late, but I think there's been a fascinating discussion in the group chat as well that I want to touch on briefly. If people are willing to go a little bit longer, I understand if people have to leave, but if we can maybe do a real quick. I know, Bryce, you sort of started it, and Jen, if you could also chime in. You're talking about fiduciary, thinking about a fiduciary duty approach lens as well. So maybe, Bryce, if you could give a real quick summation of your question, and then Jen, if you could amplify, and then we'll go to Davi for a response.
Sure. So briefly, I guess my concern is motivated by the fact that privacy preserving technologies and a focus on privacy, and informed consent, kind of shifts the discussion to sort of procedural landscape where whether it's using homomorphic encryption or, so-called better consent mechanisms, we can sort of address that issue of getting the data, but it says nothing about, what ethical norms exist once you have the data, which to me is far more critical, because the reality is, even if I've obtained data through consent and anonymized it or whatever, the way I use that data could harm not only the person whose data it is, but also people whose data I haven't collected. So I'm actually really concerned with this emphasis on privacy and informed consent, that it actually narrows the field to areas which I think are technically tractable, and therefore ignores a lot of areas that may not have a more obvious technical solution, like how do we preserve a relationship with of trust and act as responsible citizens, corporate citizens or otherwise.
Thank you, Bryce. And Jen, if you're also still on real quick, I know you sort of amplified that as well, and then we'll go to Davi for the final thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I was just trying to add a little background just because I know this space, and it's just to focus on bringing this idea of fiduciary duties, legally binding fiduciary duties of care to information providers, and to basically kind of force them into acting into the primary user's best interest. Although there was a great, I think, point raised in the chat that there are situations we're trying to define who the kind of user group might be that you're trying to act in their best interest. How you define that can be really complicated. I mean, the discussions I've seen have really been only in the context of thinking about us as users of Facebook and Google and so on, and not maybe those thornier areas of like B2B potentially applications, and trying to figure out who the stakeholders are.
So Davi, do you have thoughts on that? Recognizing we can maybe spend an entire new salon on that, but I don't know if you have any sort of like interesting thoughts there.
So I think, first of all, I'd like to go back to and double down on the knowledge is power, and the idea that Wollstonecraft lays out for us. The reason to be educated is because it gives you something, you get something. And so that's sort of the core of this is the consent is, why would you be giving it to someone, which I started with as one of the privacy concerns. Are you giving it to someone who's going to use it in your best interests? And then if not, how are you going to claw back? So I would say it's right there. Maybe I didn't explain it well enough, but it's right there. And the core of this is the consent is around the use and the delegated use, to Jen's point. If there's B2B, and that's the classic case of Facebook again, is if you consent for a certain thing and then it gets interpreted as access by another group for other purposes, and other people are exposed that didn't consent at all because they're associated with you, right? These are the degrees of consent that really, for me, map to technical controls. So maybe I'm using consent too broadly to represent what I see as a control that I can build into the technology. But that to me is where, for example, we have business logic around what root or administrator is supposed to do. Some people argue, and I would say falsely, but it's a valid point, but they argue it falsely, that if you have admin, you have everything, so game over. Or if you have root, game over. But that's not true. Root and administrator are meant to do very specific business things. They have a specific time that they're supposed to work, or a specific place, or a specific way or thing that they're authorized to do. Anybody who becomes root and then just says, game over, I can do whatever I want now, is an abuser of power. That's a fascist. I mean, that's the police. Once I put my badge on, game over. I can do whatever I want to anyone I want in this community. So there's actually things that they're authorized to do. And that's whether it be work with other agencies, whether it be share information across state lines or nations, right? So the process of approving that through, consent might not be the right word, but there's a number of gates, and the technology has to reflect that. So I was trying to build systems, for example, for extracting information from Google, which is a monolithic email archive, so that somebody could look for, investigate crimes. And now if you have multiple investigators investigating a similar crime and they're overlapping on email, should they share the same extraction, or should they all be dipping back into Google? So do you open it up multiple times, and then how do you maintain security across all those different versions of it? So the technology has to, again, fit the human condition of being authorized to share the information for a purpose, and that's where consent comes in. I want you to solve cancer. Actually, let me give a good medical example. I want to give up a certain amount of information like COVID or cancer or something, so that I can improve the chances of my family or me surviving that disease. But right now, the way the technology works, if I consent to that and they get the data, people who really care, who have ethics, will destroy the data after they've done that one thing, because it's way too difficult for them to come back and ask, okay, we have a change, we'd like to do some other stuff. There's just not a good mechanism. We'd like to build technology mechanisms that say, hey, we've gone down this path, we'd like to do some other stuff, is that okay? And for you to say yes, no in a meaningful way, not just to have it stored data in their hands, but actually you to store the data, you to maintain the control of the data, and them to be coming to your door. In other words, rather than you living in their skyscraper where you go in and they define what gets done to you while you're there, like a hotel or a condo, you actually get your plot of land, and every time they want to come talk to you or see you, they come to your front door and knock, and you decide whether to open it or not, and whether to kick them out of your house. That's the difference in, hopefully that makes sense, how consent comes into a control.
Very helpful, Davi, and I like your view of consent as giving permission for a specific set of sequence protocols or gates, as you said. And it's not just giving you access to everything, but that I have the reasonable expectations that in giving this authorization, there are gates to what you do. You don't have access to everything. So with that, I want to thank you. This has been a robust conversation. Thank you for everyone that went into overtime here. We will have a recording available too for those who want to watch it later. You've been an amazing guest, Davi. Really want to also thank Accenture, our partners with doing this. And we look forward to our next event that we will be having on July 29th. If you save the date, when we'll be talking to the Chief Data Officer for California. And thank you again, Davi, for being a wonderful guest here with the Atlantic Council and Accenture. Thank you.